Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
The finding of his DNA wasn't just on the murder weapon, it was on a most important part of the murder weapon.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed.
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science brought the most dangerous killers to justice.
A truly horrific criminal, a monster.
It's a hammer blow. You don't know how you're going to carry on.
We'll hear how some of the most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
He basically said to me, she's in the house, go and find her.
The amount of blood that was there indicated that there was a frenzied attack.
There was no reasonable explanation for them. That's why he changed his plea.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
The key thing about having a DNA profile is you've got probably the sharpest tool in the box.
I was so elated beforehand. We didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden, we'd cracked it.
In this episode, a tight-knit community of friendly neighbours discover why their friend has been missing.
They glanced through the bedroom door. They could see that her body was in the bed.
Forensic evidence that can lead to only one conclusion.
In the context of somebody tied up with an electrode fixed somewhere, like the toe, hinted at electrical torture.
And a midnight call signalling one family's nightmare.
I took Dad aside and told him that Lane was dead.
This is forensics, catching the killer.
I was 14 at the time. I was living with my mum and dad. Dad was a fisherman and that, and I loved my school and my friends, so it's a sort of close community. And it was just really nice to live at the time. It was nice.
In 1984, 14-year-old Nicola Scott was living with her family in the Scottish coastal town of Dunbar, less than 50 kilometres east of the capital, Edinburgh.
That night I had been with my friends at the time, and I went home and nobody was in the house, and I thought I'm quite peckish, you know. And the dog was there. Well, the dog comes everywhere with me. And we went up the street to the chip shop, which is in the main high street, and that's where I met him, outside the chip shop.
The man she met was a family friend of Nicola's, and someone who both she and her parents trusted.
So we went down the harbour, and I was going to go right round and then back to my house. And that's when he said to me, we walked down the harbour, past the Castle pub, and then you go past the other pub, the Jersey, and he says, oh, Nicky, come in, I'll show you the glass at my house. He opened his door and he says, come in and I'll show you the glass. I just walked in, never thought anything. There was no lights. And then the next minute, I had a knife at my throat. I was petrified. I just started shaking. The dog was barking, and that's when he told me he was going to kill my dog. And he sort of led me. I don't know if it was a living room, because the house was absolutely pitch black. But the smell, that's what I can mind. It was absolutely stinking. And I still had the knife at my throat. And then he must have put me through, which was, I don't know if it was a bedroom, because I couldn't see at all. So he was just leading me, and he made me take my clothes off myself. And then he forced me on the bed, and that's when he must have had ropes, and that's when he tied me up.
During the attack, Nicola was sexually assaulted and smothered.
With being a fisherman, he knew all about the ropes, can they tie ropes and everything? He knew all about that, so when I was tied up, he tried to suffocate me 2 or 3 times with a pillow. That was horrible because I couldn't breathe, and when he was doing that, I thought, that's it, I'm gone. But he was quite shouting and violent, you know, and at the time I just kept saying, look, just let me go, I'll not tell anybody, you know, I'll not say nothing. It's weird, the things that race through your mind, you know, at the time you're thinking, am I going to see my mum again? Or I thought, this is it, I'm away, he's not going to let me out of here, I reckon, what's going to happen, you know? But it was horrible.
To her surprise, the attacker released Nicola. Still terrified, she made it to his front door, and once outside, back towards her home.
I didn't look behind, but I tried to look 2 or 3 times behind, and I could see him following me, but I just thought, keep walking, just keep going. And then when I got to the road end, which there's a garage, I thought, right, I'll have a quick look, and he had just disappeared.
Once in the safety of her home, the teenager couldn't hide the terror of what she'd gone through.
Told my dad everything. I burst into tears, and my dad just got his clothes on and went out looking for him. And then I had a bath because I just felt absolutely disgusting. It was degrading me, just made me feel dirty. I just felt, oh, you know, somebody older than me that's, you know, that somebody that age can attack a young girl, that I just couldn't believe somebody that I trusted could do that to my family after my dad giving him a job and being on the lifeboat and everything. He was well known about the community as well in the harbour, and everybody got on with him as well, you know. I just couldn't take it in, you know.
Unable to find the attacker, Nicola's father took her to local police to report the incident. But the man who assaulted her had fled Dunbar, and with a lack of evidence, no charge was ever brought. What did remain for Nicola was fear and trauma.
I used to have nightmares for weeks. I used to have nightmares about it. It was terrible. I used to think, oh, he's got to come and get her, he's got to sit outside the house. Or I never went to school for a wee while after it either. After that, he just totally disappeared, you know. It was crazy.
"15 years later, and the man who attacked Nicola would resurface. It's April 1999. The location, one of Edinburgh's toughest housing estates.
1999, Muirhouse unfortunately had a really bad reputation as being a crime-ridden, socially deprived estate.
Jane Hamilton was a journalism student in the Scottish capital.
So there was a really vibrant community, and there was a lot of, you know, community activism going on to try and better the area, and a lot of good people lived there.
It was that close-knit community who noticed that one of their neighbours, 46-year-old Elaine Colley, hadn't been seen around for a while.
This was the Easter holiday weekend, and she was very, very friendly with one lady that lived nearby, very close, and one gentleman, as in just purely a friendship with these people, but she saw them. So they got a wee bit concerned collectively that they hadn't seen her for a couple of days.
Bert Swanson was the Detective Chief Inspector on call at the city's Leith police station at the time.
They are alert enough to realise that something is amiss here. It's been near 4 days, and we see this lady every day, and she's not said she's going away or anything. So that was triggering something, and then they've come together and said, can we look through the letterbox And when I look through a letterbox the first time, the gentleman on his own, he has a look and he sees that the flower pot is over. But that in itself, to him, something may have just toppled over as she's left. So that doesn't spark it. But he then gets in touch with this other lady who lives nearby, who's a very close friend of Elaine's. So when he relays that to her and says, can you come up with me? And she's got a spare set of keys, so better still. So they go up and they then knock on the door and there's no reply, so they turn the key and they go in. And when they glanced through the bedroom door, they could see that her body was in the bed, and it's clear that she's dead, and all is clearly not as it should be.
On the 5th of April 1999, police in Scotland had been called to the home of 46-year-old Elaine Colley on the Edinburgh housing estate of Muir House. Elaine's neighbours had found her dead in her home, having not been seen for a few days. Her closest family members, namely her brother, sister-in-law and nephew, were living in New Zealand.
We received it, I think, possibly midnight, 1 o'clock New Zealand time. I'd just gone to bed. You're sort of waking up out of a stupor, effectively, and you just hear, that Elaine's dead. I don't sort of recall too much in terms of what I was told. I certainly recall that we weren't given any sort of details that it was a murder. And then it was a case of obviously getting clothes on and going down to where my parents were and telling them, which was exceptionally hard. Yeah, it was. My wife sort of went to see my mother, and I took Dad aside and told him that Elaine was dead. Being so far away, there's a sense of slight disbelief, but also knowing that it must be true. So.
As police began to investigate, they discovered a well-liked woman with cultural interests and who lived a happy, independent life.
She was a legal secretary for most of her working life. She loved arts, poetry, music. And she would visit her friend regularly because they lived just, literally yards away from each other.
Yeah, she was definitely well known, and was well known at the local corner shop as well. On very good friendly terms with everyone. While she only had a sort of small group of friends, just a lovely, quiet lady who sort of lived life on her terms. Somebody who was quite content in the life that she had sort of made for herself, and she loved Edinburgh to bits. And I used to arrive in Edinburgh, and nothing was ever too much trouble. I was in my early 20s and could look after myself, but she'd make sure that she was at Waverley Station to meet me, make sure that she'd come to see me off at Waverley Station and stuff like that. So, she really, like I said, nothing was too much trouble for her.
The task now was to determine how Elaine died. Crime scene investigator Tom Finney was one of the first to enter her flat.
We were called here regarding a suspicious death at that particular time. I went in, carried out a visual examination, and the first thing that struck me, there was an overturned pot plant in the hallway. There was some earth strewn along the hallway, and there also appeared to be drag marks in the carpet, along the carpet in the hallway. We entered the bedroom area, and Elaine was lying in her bed, duvet cover covering her. But I started to note one or two items on the bedroom floor. There's small pieces of plastic lying adjacent to the bed. There was a couple of smears of blood on the duvet cover. Some blue fibres were also noted.
And there were other small clues which the forensic teams and detectives quickly became aware of.
Looking closely at the bed itself, I could see that there was an electric blanket on the bed, but the cable was missing from the point of the control box, the switch, and it had the appearance that the cable had been cut. So there was a stretch missing and there was nothing in the socket. There was trousers which was on the ground, basically in a heap, and that in itself, you know, makes you look at something. We're talking here, remember, about a person, you know, everything else that I had seen and observed was in keeping with this as a fastidious, a tidy person. But there's these things that's just slightly out of sync with that.
The clues weren't just found in Elaine's bedroom.
There were one or two items lying on the living room floor. Included was a pair of spectacles, an unusual place, just almost lying in the, just on the floor. The rest of the house was very tidy. One or two drawers had been opened, one or two things lying on the floor, but she looked like she'd gone to bed. There was a cup of tea sitting on her bedside cabinet. So, by all intents and purposes, it looked like she'd just gone to bed. And obviously it's come to some, natural death. But the gut reaction, there is obviously something going on in that scene that is not normal. There's too many factors starting to add up. So the forensic team, start to obviously formulate a feel for the whole thing. And at that stage, we thought we were dealing with a homicide.
Realising this might be a suspicious death, pathologist Basil Perdue was called to the flat to make his initial assessment and preserve forensic evidence before Elaine's body was moved.
There was a lot of bruising on the arms, and it had band-like bruising around both wrists, or at least partway around both wrists. For practical purposes, you can't bruise a dead body. It's not something that's happened after death. These bruises have happened while Elaine was alive, and it suggests she may well have been manhandled. And that tended to support the idea that she'd quite possibly been tied up or restrained in some way with ligatures, in other words, bindings of some kind.
While some things remained unclear, the pathologist's team were able to provide other answers.
They weren't able clearly to give a definitive cause of death because of the state of the decomposition. But they were clear here that there was what appeared to be two blunt trauma injuries to the head.
And it also transpired that Elaine had been subjected to a terrible sexual assault. But the most shocking discovery of all was so tiny, it could very easily have been missed.
There was a particular mark which caught my interest very strongly indeed, which was a mark on the inside of the right little toe. And what it was on the back of the toe. It was 3 millimetres in width, and it was about ½ an inch, 1.2 centimetres in length. And looking at it, I thought it might be an electric mark. When electricity comes into contact with human skin, it can leave distinctive markings. Now, we were looking at a body that was decomposing, which makes things difficult. And I still felt that we ought to treat this as an electric mark because I was highly suspicious of it. It's a very strange place to see a mark of that sort, and it was partly encircling the toe.
Skin samples were taken from Elaine's toe and sent to the laboratory for further testing, and the results were even more surprising.
So we'd found heat coagulation and copper deposited on the skin. The preservative fluid we use to prepare the skin to be able to examine it ourselves doesn't contain copper, so it can't have come from there. The human body itself contains only infinitesimal amounts of copper. You do need a little tiny bit of it, but not enough to have a deposit of this size in the skin. So it has to be something that's come from outside. It's got to be extraneous copper. If you wrap a wire around your finger or any other part of your body, it doesn't deposit enough copper to be detected. It simply can't be picked up. It's just too little. However, if it's a live conductor at mains voltage, then it will deposit copper. So our findings strongly suggested to us that what we were dealing with was a live conductor wrapped round the right little toe and acting as a static electrode.
As the pathologists and detectives realised, this could mean only one thing.
One uses the word torture very sparingly, if at all, in autopsies, but in the context of somebody tied up with an electrode fixed somewhere, like the toe, and another one capable of being applied to different bits of the body, we said it hinted at electrical torture.
In April 1999, police in Edinburgh had found the body of a 46-year-old woman, Elaine Colley, in bed in her flat. She had suffered blunt force trauma to her head and had been sexually assaulted. But most terrifying of all were signs that Elaine had been tortured with electrocution, using the cable from an electric blanket. Detectives knew there was a killer on the loose, and the local community wondered if that person was in their midst.
We had got word that there had been a murder not far from where we were studying, so of course, you know, everybody was a bit frightened because this was an unusual murder. It wasn't to do with drugs, and it wasn't a domestic, so it was, you know, it caused a bit of a stir because, you know, people were wondering, oh my goodness, what's happened? You know, is there a serial killer on the loose? It was very quickly, you know, there were rumours that you know, somebody was going about massacring young women.
But how could someone living in a highly populated housing estate have been tortured and murdered in her own home with neighbours and other flats surrounding her on all sides?
It was a block, and from memory it had 16 flats, so I think it's 4 on each level. It is a standard and common stair that gives access to each of those. Now, although there's 16 flats, they weren't all occupied. The people there and in that area, to be perfectly honest, tended to keep themselves to themselves. So it was not unusual. Nobody actually heard anything.
With no vital information from neighbours, detectives would now rely on forensic evidence collected from Elaine's home to help identify who might have tortured and then killed her.
We carried out an examination of the spectacles recovered from the living room area back in the identification branch, and we found a fingerprint on the lens of one of the lenses of the spectacles. That fingerprint would obviously be compared against Elaine Colley's fingerprints to eliminate, because it quite possibly could be hers, but in this particular instance it wasn't Elaine's, so there was a very good chance whoever had assaulted her, it could be their fingerprint.
Elaine's glasses weren't the only place where key fingerprints were found.
We also found a set of prints low down on the bedroom door, and that led into where Elaine had been recovered, body had been recovered. The supposition was that she had possibly been dragged through the hallway, and when she entered into the bedroom area, she possibly grabbed out and tried to hold to stop herself being dragged and held onto the bedroom door. And that clearly is supposition, but having fingerprints that low down on the bedroom door tended to indicate that it wasn't a natural position for the fingerprints to be in.
Elaine's highly organised life and home would yield much of the information DCI Bert Swanson's team would need in piecing together her last movements.
The main house keys was missing. There was no keys. Now, you know, when we were chatting and getting statements from people, we know that she came in just before 4 o'clock on this particular day. So she obviously had her keys to get into the house. So where are they? The good thing about Elaine in this particular case was the fact that she was a very meticulous person, a very tidy person. She had worked in an accountant's office. I believe she worked for solicitors at one stage and that. So all her records and that was very, very good. So when it comes to banking information, for instance, we were able to find information from her files that will still be there. So that at least leads us straight into the bank. And in this particular case, from that process, we found that there was 2 bank cards missing. That account was accessed. And the good thing then was that we were in the stage where the ATMs were having the camera. Not the best quality, I should add, but you were getting some footage as well.
And other records provided yet more vital clues that detectives needed.
They checked her telephone to see where the last phone call was made to. It led them to a house about 1.5 miles away from where Elaine actually lived. The house belonged to a woman, and police officers visited this woman to speak to her to ascertain what the phone call was about and how she knew Elaine Colley. During the course of that interview, it then emerged that the woman actually lived with a man, and that man was John Jock Reid.
Now, police needed to understand just who was John or Jock Reid and what was his connection to Elaine.
So John Jock Reid was originally from Dunbar in East Lothian. He didn't live specifically in Muirhouse, he lived in West Granton, which was about 1.5 miles away from Muirhouse. He had an extensive criminal record, mostly for drunken behaviour, assaults and petty theft. He'd been in and out of prison for various things, but nothing what we would regard as being serious.
But it soon emerged that Reid had a very strong alibi.
He was arrested the same night as Elaine's death. They, in fact, arrested him for being drunk and incapable. He's been sentenced the following morning, on a Saturday morning, to 4 months in prison, so he's incarcerated in Saughton Prison. So there's no immediate danger to any other person here, whilst we loosely regard him as our strong suspect at this stage. We're learning, of course, about him, and we're learning that where he lives with his girlfriend, and from the girlfriend we learn of the existence of this other flat.
He actually had a flat adjacent to Elaine's on the same landing, obviously, and he used this as more of a postal drop. It was not really a flat that had been lived in.
After securing a warrant, detectives and forensic investigators gained entry to this other apartment. One of those present was forensic scientist Shirley Marshall.
The property, although it was very busy, there was lots of furniture and lots of electrical equipment and bits of debris around, which looked as if the person was into DIY or like an electrician type of a workshop type thing. What we try and do as forensic scientists is to be able to create links between things. Elaine was found in a bed. On that bed there were wooden posts, and we know that there were shards or pieces of fibres found behind the bed that appeared to be like blue polypropylene type rope. And then subsequently blue rope was found in Reid's property. We then had to take advice on the knot examination because there were knots in the rope, and the rope was actually quite expertly spliced, which is something you don't see very often.
In order to get that advice, DCI Bert Swanson brought in an expert knot and rope specialist.
He explained, and what he said was that, to me, this is the type of knot that I would associate with someone who's a fisherman or has knowledge of working on the sea, would be using this type of it. And in addition to all of that, clearly we're looking at the background of who we're looking at. And indeed, lo and behold, we find that the person that we have in now as a strong suspect did in fact work on a fishing boat.
Back in the lab, Shirley Marshall was able to examine the rope further.
We did a microscopic examination under a low-power microscope to look for blood and traces of skin. Because if someone is bound with rope, then they tend to potentially get small pieces of skin trapped in it or surface rubbed off. And we did find some areas that appeared to be skin and also blood, which were DNA tested and matched back to Elaine. We did observe blood staining on the bedding and blood staining on Elaine's clothing that was being worn at the time. So we knew that there was the potential there for blood to be transferred to the assailant.
And surprisingly, Reed, being incarcerated, assisted the forensic investigation.
So we were also in the situation where he was in prison. He'd been arrested on the Friday of that bank holiday weekend, and his clothing was seized at that time. So we were able to look at his clothing that he was wearing on the Friday. Blood staining was found on the front of his jacket and also on his jeans.
And more connections to the crime were being discovered in Reed's flat, notably a cable for an electric blanket.
2 officers had been sent down to the electric blanket factory in the north of England, and they were actually on a phone call to the murder team with information from the factory about what the plug might look like from that electric blanket. So they were already looking for intelligence information in order to try and link that flex with the plug potentially to Elaine's electric blanket to see whether that had been removed from the crime scene and into Reed's property next door. I was involved in the examination of the cable for blood, which we did find, and that matched back to Elaine. So the cable with the plug attached that was found in Reed's property could be linked to matching the DNA profile of Elaine and therefore linked back to her property. But also the identification branch looked very closely for, there were a number of small pieces of the white cable from the electric blanket were found in Elaine's property, but also a key piece was found on the floor of Reed's flat, if I remember rightly, between the kitchen and the lounge. And that became really key in being able to put a physical fit together to link that flex to the electric blanket next door.
Once again, items recovered during Reed's arrest would provide further evidence against him.
Looked at the video evidence from the police station, which there was in place at that time, the way in which he was processed, and in that I could see that he was emptied his belongings, his pockets onto that, and he had, amongst other things, a set of keys. And one of the sets of keys, the officer picked it up and says, "Is that an E on that? What's that?" And they never replied. And the officer didn't say anything further, just put it back in the property. So again, I go to Saughton prison, check that his property is there, what's happened to his property since he's been inside, and the set of keys were still there. Took possession of the set of keys from the prison, took it down to the flat at Muirhouse, and one set opened the door of Elaine Colley, the deceased flat, and the other set opened the door of the accused flat next door.
In April 1999, police in Edinburgh were investigating the murder of 46-year-old Elaine Colley. She had been found dead in her bed in the city's Muirhouse area. Pathologists have found signs of blunt force trauma, sexual assault, and torture by electrocution using an electric blanket. Detectives and crime scene investigators had found a wealth of evidence in Elaine's flat and that of her neighbour, who was now the main suspect, John "Jock" Reid. Fortuitously, he was already in custody, having been arrested for offences including being drunk and incapable on the day of Elaine's murder.
We were informed by the major incident team that a suspect had come into the frame. When a comparison was carried out at a later date, we found a match for a thumbprint belonging to John Reid, which was great evidence because it placed John Reid in the flat handling the spectacles at some time.
The positive identification of these prints, along with forensic evidence found on the rope used to tie Elaine's wrist, the electrocution blanket, and images from a nearby ATM machine, all helped detectives to piece together how the murder happened, and possibly why.
Earlier in the day, he'd spoke to somebody who says, "You owe me £100. So he was wheeling and dealing in old cars. And at that stage, he says, "I don't have the money." He said, "Well, you have to get the money." So there was words exchanged. Now that became significant because he had said and given assurance to the guy, "Look, I'll get the money." So that's the same day as Elaine died. We know that Elaine went into her flat roughly about 4 o'clock because immediately after that, 11 minutes, I think it was, past 4, there was a phone call from her flat to what turns out to be the girlfriend of the accused.
Elaine's killer had actually knocked on her door and asked if he could use her phone to make an emergency phone call. And because she had probably seen him in the passing, you know, more than once, he wasn't a stranger to her. Although she wasn't friendly with him, she knew his face to say hello to, so that there wouldn't have been any alarm or any sense of danger when Elaine answered the door to her killer that night.
DCI Bert Swanson had Reid brought from the prison where he was being held to Leith Police Station for questioning.
He admitted that he had gone into the flat to use the phone. He then said that he had come away from that and that he had got himself blind drunk and that the rest is a blank to him. He knows nothing else about it. It's very rare for them to actually give you a confession at that stage or to admit to any wrongdoing, and that's what happened here. So it wasn't a surprise to us, but equally there was a sufficiency of evidence for us to do what we were doing, so therefore we knew he was the guilty party at that time.
Reid was charged with the murder of Elaine Colley on the 21st of April 1999, just 16 days after her body was found. Presented with the overwhelming evidence against him, he pleaded guilty to her murder and to stealing £350 from her. Elaine's family travelled from New Zealand to attend the hearing held at the Edinburgh High Court later that year.
My father, my mother and I came back over for the court hearing, and we knew it was going to be a guilty plea and sentencing.
The accused himself had really nothing to say there. He had admitted that he was who he is, and that's all he's asked for. He's not asked for an explanation at this juncture in the court proceedings. It's beyond that. So he's there for the sentence, and that's what happened to him.
Reid was sentenced a month later. He was given a life sentence with a minimum prison sentence of 15 years before he could apply for parole.
But the murder and torture of Elaine wasn't Reid's only crime which came to light. There were other attacks and victims, some from many years earlier.
he had been accused of 3 further sex attacks in the past. When he left Dunbar, it emerged that he actually didn't leave of his own volition. He was actually run out of town because he had been accused of trying to rape a 14-year-old girl. The second sex attack that Reid was accused of was an attempt to rape a woman in a graveyard, and the only reason that he was unsuccessful was the woman's screams attracted passers-by and they chased him off. The third sex attack was on a male who he attempted to attack at a bus stop and was unsuccessful because the man managed to fight him off.
One of those previous victims, Nicola, was at home when police came to visit her, 15 years after she had been attacked.
I just said, "Do you know Jock Reid?" I says, "Yes. What can I do? Could we speak to you?" And when they told me, I couldn't believe it. I says, "I do not believe he's murdered somebody." When I phoned my dad, I says, "You're not going to believe this, he's murdered somebody, Dad." I says, "That could have been me."
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial. So many elements, so many different parts of forensic science kind of overlap. I think there were about 8 different scientific reports, lots of different experts involved. I mean, it is overwhelming.
John Reid died of COVID in 2021, while he was still incarcerated. One question remained unanswered and went with him to his grave: why he killed Elaine for just a few £100s.
Some of it is cruel beyond belief, but it's a tragedy. It's an unnecessary tragedy for anybody and everybody. I mean, if money was all he was seeking and needing here, he could have got money. He could have got the money. He could have got the cards. He could have achieved what he set out to do. So you have to say that he wanted more than just money.
But for Elaine's family, there were no answers as to why Reid had chosen her, and nor will there ever be.
She was a gentle, quiet person who lived her life as she wanted to. And what Reid did to Elaine has left a deep scar on my father. You know, he's her big brother. What she went through was horrific. She suffered horrendous physical and mental terror over a sustained period of time. And, like any family member, it's an impossible thing, but you wish that there was something you could have done to have changed it. I don't think we'll ever be able to get over it. You know, what are we, 23 years since it happened? It still hurts. You know, people say that the time's a great healer, but, when you actually think of what went on, it is very difficult to still stay composed about.